Look at the events you've written down. Is it real to you that the conclusion you reached, I'm inadequate, is a valid interpretation of those events? Can you agree that virtually any child at that age, in those situations, would have reached a similar conclusion? If so, you're probably ready to play the possibilities game. We'll imagine that 4 of your friends are visiting you and looking at a videotape of those events that you wrote down. Your interpretation of those events when you were a child was, I'm inadequate. That is one valid interpretation of Mom and Dad's behavior. But there are other reasonable interpretations of the same childhood events that you didn't think of then. So let's ask each of your friends for another alternative interpretation. Can you see that one friend might well say, Mom and Dad thought you weren't adequate, but they were just plain wrong? Couldn't the idea, Mom and Dad thought you were inadequate but were just plain wrong, explain those events in your childhood just as well as your original interpretation, I'm inadequate? Here's what your second friend says. Mom and Dad were mad and annoyed because they weren't patient, not because you weren't adequate. Doesn't this interpretation also explain those events in your childhood just as well as your interpretation, that I'm inadequate? Here's a third possible interpretation of those childhood events. Mom and Dad compared you to others because they thought you could do anything others could do because you were so adequate. Doesn't this interpretation also explain those events in your childhood just as well as your original interpretation that I'm inadequate? Those experiences with your parents could be explained in many different ways. Here's one your fourth friend suggests. Mom and Dad's annoyance wasn't because you weren't adequate. They just had unrealistic expectations for a child your age. Couldn't any one of these interpretations explain these events just as well as the statement, I'm inadequate? Of course they can. So is it real to you that a belief you've lived with almost your entire life, something that you thought was a fact, is not a fact, isn't the truth at all? It's only a truth, merely one interpretation of many possible interpretations of earlier events. Right? Please continue to interact totally with this program in order for it to work, and that includes answering my questions out loud, even if your answer is a simple yes or no. So, let me repeat the question. Is it real that I'm inadequate is not a fact? It's not the truth, but just a truth, merely one interpretation of many possible interpretations of earlier childhood events. I bet it is now. With a little help from me and your friends, you can see that those times when you either didn't do the things they wanted the way they wanted, or they did too much for you, or compared you to others, could have at least 4 different reasonable interpretations or meanings. Do you remember what you wrote down a few minutes ago as the source of your belief, I'm inadequate? Look at the text below on your screen. Right now, imagine seeing what you saw then and hearing what you heard then. Now take a few moments and really imagine the events of your childhood that led you to conclude, I'm inadequate. Didn't it seem, when you were a child, as if you could actually see I'm inadequate in those earlier events with your parents? It did, didn't it? You may have the sense that you didn't see the belief. You felt it. Once you formed the belief I'm inadequate, you probably did feel it too. I'll get back to the feeling in a minute. But what I'd like you to focus on now is not the feeling, but on my question. Didn't it seem as if you saw I'm inadequate? As if you could point to it, As if you could have said to me, I can see evidence that I'm inadequate. I didn't hear you. Did you say yes? Remember what I explained when you were eliminating the earlier beliefs. What happened was that you looked at events that could have had many different meanings and chose one, which in this case was, I'm inadequate. By giving that specific meaning to the events, each time you saw Mom and Dad's behavior, it was as if you could see the meaning in their behavior. But you didn't discover the meaning in the events. You gave the meaning to the events. They had no meaning before you gave them one. Now that you know that it seemed as if you saw I'm inadequate as a child, I'd like you to look again. Did you really see I'm inadequate? If you did, what does I'm inadequate look like? Could you really point to it? Does I'm inadequate have a color, a shape, a location? Even if your parents said those very words to you, you still only saw them say it. You never heard that it was true. There are as many interpretations of your parents saying something as there are of their behavior. You can't see that anything they say is necessarily true, or even that they believed it themselves. Is it real to you now that you saw events but never really did see I'm inadequate? If anything you can really see can be described, and if you can't describe what I'm inadequate looks like, is it clear now that you never really saw it? Since you never really saw I'm inadequate, what did you actually see? Is it clear now all you really saw was the reaction of one or both of your parents when you did something they weren't happy about, or you saw them doing lots of things for you and not allowing you to do them? In other words, all you really saw was a series of events. You see, what happened was that you looked at a series of events that can be interpreted in many different ways. You gave the events one meaning, which is, I'm inadequate. By attributing that specific meaning to the events, each time you saw Mom and Dad's behavior, it was as if you could see that meaning in their behavior. But you didn't discover the meaning in the events. You attributed the meaning to the events. They had no meaning before you gave them one. Is it real now that the events had no meaning until you attributed one to them? Here's another way to understand that events have no inherent meaning. When I say that, I'm saying you don't know anything for sure about you, about other people, about life as a result of these experiences. What do I know for sure about you from knowing about how your parents treated you when you were a child? Is it clear that I wouldn't know anything? And if I don't know anything, you don't either. All you know for sure is what actually happened. Your mom and dad sounded annoyed or angry and perhaps punished you when you didn't do what they wanted you to do when they wanted you to do it. And finally, if you never saw I'm inadequate out there in the world, where has it been all these years? Did I hear you say that I'm inadequate has only ever existed in your mind? That you never did see it out in the world? That's right. If the belief is more real to you as a feeling than as a concept, here's another way to look at it. Didn't it seem as if your parents' behavior and comments when you were a child made you feel like you were inadequate? It did, didn't it? Earlier, you realized that the events have no meaning. Is it possible for events that have no meaning to make you feel I'm inadequate, or anything else for that matter? Of course not. So if Mom and Dad's behavior couldn't have made you feel I'm inadequate, what did make you feel that? By now I think you know the answer to that question. Please answer out loud. That's right. You felt I'm inadequate only because that's the meaning you had already given to your parents' behavior. Let me help you make this real. Imagine that I had been there when you were a little child and had shown you the interpretations we talked about a few minutes ago for your parents' behavior. And after that conversation, you concluded, my parents are having unreasonable expectations of me. Their annoyance has nothing to do with whether I'm adequate or not. Here's what I'd like you to do now. Take a moment and really imagine being a child and Mom and Dad get annoyed at you again for something you did or didn't do. Or imagine them not allowing you to try new things on your own. As you imagine the events, apply this different interpretation to their behavior. Notice how it feels to be a child who's thinking, my parents have expectations of me that are too high for a child of my age to reach. That's why they get annoyed, not because I'm inadequate. If your belief was based on the fact that your parents would do things for you, imagine that you had decided their behavior means they thought I couldn't do these things, but that doesn't mean they were right. Not because I'm inadequate. You can use the pause button below to pause the video while you make this childhood scenario more real for yourself. When you're done imagining, press the play button. As you imagine the scene, does it still feel like your parents' words and actions are making you feel I'm inadequate? Probably not. And if you didn't feel I'm inadequate then, would you feel it now? Again, the answer is no, isn't it? So Mom and Dad's behavior never caused you to feel I'm inadequate. That feeling came from your interpretation of their behavior. And since your feelings were not caused by external events, they were only the result of a meaning you made up to explain the events. Is it real that the feelings you had when your parents were annoyed or angry didn't tell you anything at all about whether or not you were adequate? They didn't, did they? Okay, now, take a deep breath. Let it out slowly. And then say out loud, I'm inadequate. Does it still feel like it's true at all? Even a little bit? Your answer is very important here. Don't forget that when we form beliefs, we give meaning to events that have no real meaning. When we think we observe the meaning in the events out there in the world, it becomes a fact for us. Once we realize that the earlier events never had any real meaning, that the meaning was only in our mind, that it was never a fact, that the feeling we had was caused by the meaning we gave meaningless events, the belief disappears forever. Take another deep breath. Okay, say, I'm inadequate, out loud. I'll bet it feels very different when you say those words now than when you said them at the beginning of this exercise. Do these words feel true, even a little bit? Unless the belief is 100% gone and the words don't feel true at all, you probably still have the belief. Remember, holding a belief is like being pregnant. You either is or you ain't. There's no sort of. If the belief is still there, it probably still seems like you saw it. Once it no longer seems as if you saw, I'm inadequate, in those early events, the belief will be gone. So please click the repeat button to repeat that step of the process. If the belief is gone, please click continue.